Good morning, everyone. Thanks for logging in and taking a look at this training session today. My name is Scott Marquardt. I'm the Chief of Police with the City of Milton Police Department.
Good morning, I'm Carrie Wyatt. I'm a teacher at Craig High School. We're in my classroom actually at the moment, and I represent the Janesville School District on the Rock County Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force.
Hi, my name is Jamie Council. I am the Sexual Assault Nurse Coordinator at Mercy Hospital and Trauma Center, and I am the medical piece on the task force.
I'm sorry. This morning, you can see we're going to, since we are just a few minutes late, we're going to, we've given you access to our PowerPoint. We've attached a separate link for a video that we highly recommend that you watch. It's called Emmy's Story. And then our website and Facebook information is also available to you so that you can get more information. But here in just a minute after we get started, I'm going to move around so that I can direct chat questions to Scott and Jamie. And we do want to give a special thanks to Dustin Sheevy, who is one of my colleagues in the school district, and he has spent a lot of time and helped us with the technical support. So thank you for joining us.
Well, you can see our title slide. We are the Rock County Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force involved. It comprises a number of different people from throughout the county and a number of disciplines. Folks from outside of the county as well, from social service agencies to law enforcement, all volunteer groups, service organizations. A number of people are involved in the task force. You can see our mission there at the bottom. And the main thrust of the task force is youth focused, and we do end up talking about human trafficking with adults as well, simply because of the crossover. But our mission is to respond to youth who are at risk of being trafficked.
Yep, and like Scott said, our task force has over 30 different community organizations, agencies who sit at the table. Each year it seems to grow a little bit more, but we're going to kind of go through how we got started and a little bit of what we've accomplished, and then we'll get into more of the human trafficking piece, which once again is focused on our youth population, which when Scott and I start to talk about it, you'll kind of figure out there's a little bit of a difference between statutes on things that we have to work with, and then we'll tell you why we decided to focus on the youth. So this is a little bit how our task force started. Back in 2015, the Women's Fund, through the State Line Community Foundation, every year they would pick a topic that they thought the community needed to focus on of an issue, and they picked human trafficking. So when they first brought this to a bunch of different organizations, it was just human trafficking in general. And then we went through some community mapping to figure out where the greatest need was, and then that's kind of how we ended up focusing on the youth, because there's a lot of services that youth don't really qualify for when we talk about like housing or like AODA, which is drug and alcohol abuse, counseling or treatment programs. A lot of those things we have a hard time getting youth into. And it more so is because of their age. You know, after you turn 18, you can self-identify and pick different resources that you want to use, where for youth, especially if there isn't a parent or guardian in the picture, it's a little bit hard to set those services up for them unless CPS or, you know, children and family services, however you want to refer to them as, if they take custody over these kids, then we can kind of bypass a little bit of those. But for the most part, it's very hard for youth programs. And then in 2017, we decided to actually give ourselves a name. And we decided on the Rock County Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force, mainly because we're focusing in Rock County, so every single municipality, law enforcement agency, medical services, CPS, school districts, mental health, I mean, you name it. We wanted to just really target Rock County because that's where we all are working, and we wanted to make sure that we got the message out that we want to keep our youth safe. So we wanted to do these educational opportunities for our prevention and awareness to kind of get the community on board on what our goal was. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, I don't think so. That's good. In 2019, we decided that we probably needed to celebrate some of our successes, and so the task force as a group decided that we need to start looking at maybe we do an annual report. And this was the result of that conversation with what we did last year, calendar year 2019. I'm not going to go through the slide or the individual stats for you. You can look at that later. But we're growing and getting busier and pretty proud of our accomplishments. So we need to start telling people about those too.
So you can see the agency representation. That's just the amount of people on the task force in those different disciplines. So that's kind of what we're made up of. And then when you look at the donation part, we do all of these things for free for the community. We do not ask for anything. A lot of people who ask us to come in and do presentations will want to do something for us, so usually they just do it in a monetary donation, which helps us with our flyers. And then when we do different community events, we can hand out pamphlets, little bracelets, candy for kids, that type of thing. And then on like the medical piece part of it, they like to donate things of comfort. So right now, what I actually give every patient who comes through, it's not just human trafficking, it is sexual assault survivors in general and child abuse, because they kind of can all fall under that. And we can go through that too, but then they kind of get something of their own, a little bit of comfort to kind of make them feel better, and they're all super soft.
So this is the general definition of human trafficking. It truly is modern day slavery in that people are being owned by a person and forced to work. And you notice the forced fraud or coercion. You also notice that this is also just not for sex work as well, and human trafficking does expand out to a variety of different things. What we find most common in our area when it comes to law enforcement and the other agencies is it truly is the sex work and the sexual assault of children that we see most often. So that is the main focus of what we deal with in Rock County.
So with our definition, and as Scott said, with our human trafficking, the modern day slavery, so if you look up human trafficking, it's quite an umbrella. So we've got our labor trafficking under there. You have like organ harvesting, that type of thing. And depending on what you read about people who are in the United States or coming into the United States or leaving the United States, they can fall under all of those umbrellas. When we underline the forced fraud or coercion, that really is for our adult population. Those are things that have to be proven if it goes through, the judicial process when we go to court. Forced fraud and coercion, however, do not apply to our youth because they are a child, which means if they are being exploited for sexual exploitation, it's child sexual abuse. So we don't have to follow those guidelines or prove it because it's illegal any way you look at it and treat a child. So this is just a breakdown of what exactly force, would mean if they had to prove it. So it's the physical aspect, confinement, which would be, what's another word for that? False imprisonment. Yeah. Food and sleep deprivation, that's just, they're working around the clock. They have to work for their food. Maybe if they don't meet a certain quota in some instances, then they're not allowed to sleep. The drug piece is very big. Most of the time our victims, survivors that we see do have some sort of dependency, and that's what gets them through doing this. And then, the threats that are, posed to them as if you don't do this, then you can't have that, which kind of includes all of those, the abuse, confinement, and the deprivation. When you look at fraud, it's just false promises, the work and living conditions. This also obviously applies to the labor trafficking as well. The withholding of certain things, contract fraud, you sign this piece of paper, so now you're mine, which some people don't understand that that's not legal and that's not true, but when you're in this situation where somebody's essentially brainwashing you to believe it, they don't know what's truth and what's not. And then the coercion part is just more, they're threatening other people. They're saying they're going to harm them. So in a minor situation, it could be, well, if you don't do this for me, I know you have a little sibling, whether it's a male or female, because this does affect everybody as far as gender. So it's just, if you don't do things for me, then I'm going to hurt someone else. I know where you live, the debt bondage, I've been taking care of you. Now you need to pay off all this debt that I have invested into you, whether it's hair, nails, clothes, food, their shelter, that type of thing. The psychological part is pretty easy to understand. Kids are sponges, so in our minor population, it's very easy to control them and make them believe things that aren't true. This is typical also in our domestic violence population, where somebody just needs that control over them. And then the document confiscation is just more, it does happen here to, United States citizens as well, but this can be holding driver's licenses, social security cards, birth certificates. I'm not giving you any of these things. You're nobody. This is your new name. This is what you're going to say. This is your birth date, that type of thing. And then the abuse, or threatened abuse of the legal process, which essentially is nobody cares about you but me. If you go to law enforcement, they don't believe you. If you go to the hospital, they don't care about you. I'm the only person who's going to do something.
And all of these things will show up later as we talk about the signs and what to watch for as you're out in the community and see something that concerns you. Those signs will tie back to these categories as well. So there are some quick little stats for you there. Every single county in the state of Wisconsin has had cases of human trafficking. That is now in a new revision of what we report to the federal government in our crime statistics now has to include human trafficking. So we're going to do a better job going forward as law enforcement tracking it. It's quickly becoming one of the leading ways that organized crime groups make their money. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a future slide too. And like Jamie mentioned before, if it's a minor, it is already a crime to be involved in a sex act, and so it's human trafficking just by that definition. And the shocking statistic that people usually groan at the most is 12 years old is the average age, and we have had cases that we have been involved in Rock County with how young?
I think the youngest victim I've seen come through our program was 3 months old, so a 12-week-old baby. And a lot of those start with either child pornography or something where pictures got out and then somebody is identified, or maybe a parent realizes that, hey, those are pictures of my child, that type of thing. And, when we talk about 12 being the average age for all the mathematicians out there, it goes much younger than that, and it goes older than that. Now, the 12 is based on our youth population, so obviously 17 and under, because once you turn 18, so 17 and 11 months and 30 days. Mm-hmm. So anything under that is what those numbers are coming from. And I think last I knew in Wisconsin, in like a human trafficking ring, the youngest victim who was recovered was 18 months old. I don't recall the county that was in, but if you look at kids who are under 5, 6, 7 years old, a lot of them have no idea that this happened to them. So 12 might not even be an accurate number, but of the cases we get reported, that's where we're going to get the 12 from. And as far as the human trafficking of the minor situation goes, it is, people talk about child prostitution, which is something our task force has really focused on to eliminate. There is no such thing as a child prostitute. It is not possible. That is child sexual abuse. You cannot consent to any of that. It is always going to be illegal, and it's always going to be considered abuse. So my goal in my work really is to eliminate that word in general, because it was made up. it's making it seem like it was okay, like the child is choosing to do things, which by no means will ever be acceptable, and it shouldn't even be part of somebody's vocabulary. And then when you look at the human trafficking being the second largest source of income, and I know Scott can speak to this too, that's probably, from the numbers we have, that's where they're going to get the second largest. It comes second to guns and drugs, essentially. But those things are traceable. So when somebody sells a gun and somebody else gets it, those things can be recovered and documented. Same with drugs. Every time you have a certain amount of drugs and you sell it to somebody, you can get more. Like, you're constantly supplied. When you have people, it's not the same thing. First of all, when we look at human trafficking statistics, you need a victim to say that they were a victim, which is our biggest holdup, because a lot of them will never say that they're a victim because of this power and control wheel. They're made to think, and the same with the child prostitution. They're made to think this was their choice and that it's not illegal. And they're not going to come forward and say something like, this happened to me, because either they're embarrassed or they don't want people to know, or they're just stuck in this psychological trauma of, if I wouldn't have done this, then this wouldn't have happened to me, which also is not true when we're dealing with youth specifically, but of all people, it's not okay to control them. So it's hard to keep the numbers. So it is the second largest. It makes a ton of money, but you also have to keep in mind that any victim of human trafficking can be sold between 5 and 30 times a day. That's 7 days a week. That's one person. And most of these trafficking rings have probably 5 to 10 girls at a time. So they're being sold over and over and over and over again. So to try to keep track of that, and even when they get recovered, they don't know the amount of people that they've seen. And that's due also to the drug and alcohol abuse, and it's also due to the sleep deprivation. So, yeah.
If you could both speak just for a minute, I know we'll get to this later, but if you could speak to the male population that's involved in trafficking and why we don't maybe know accurate numbers for male youth being involved.
Well, from a law enforcement perspective, these crimes are underreported anyway. So whether it's physical abuse of a child or sexual abuse in the home, think about how difficult that is for someone to step forward anyway. Then think about some of the things that you hear about when a male child, and perhaps in the teens, is sexually assaulted, and think about some of the comments you hear about that boy, when I was 14, I wish I had an older girlfriend, and things like that, and those kinds of things pop up. It's a criminal act, and we are finding that it is even more difficult to get our male victims to step forward and give us that information.
Yeah, I think victim shaming is real. It happens to men and women. Typically, we do see traffickers as being the male, but there are plenty of female traffickers as well. And then when you look at, boys compared to girls, as far as being minors, and that includes everybody, no matter how you identify, those children, but specifically males are very, not groomed, but I think it's a social stigma that they're stronger and that things like this shouldn't happen, and that it was their fault, no matter how you slice it. So the easiest thing I guess I can compare it to is, all of the molestation that went on in churches of boys, and it took many years for them to come forward. I think the majority of them still have not come forward because they're made to feel embarrassed. They're not supposed to cry. They're not supposed to have these feelings of something happened to them. So the more support we can give people of just understanding none of these things are ever okay. It doesn't matter who you are, especially to our youth, but we have to grow them into people who are proud of what they are and strong enough to say, this is wrong, something happened to me, and then know that there's a network out there, which is what our task force tries to do, to kind of take them in and give them all these resources to kind of get them on this stronger building path to be successful and not stuck in this, I was a victim because of something I did, which is not true.
So we talked about this earlier as well. It's already illegal to buy sex from someone. It is already illegal, even without the money involved, to have sex with a child. And the way the legal definitions are set up and the way the statutes are written, you can't say, well, I thought she was 18 in order to circumvent that charge when dealing with child sex assault.
So this is just a little bit of an example of how traffickers, pimps, johns, however you want, I call them assailants, perpetrators, suspects, in my world is how we refer to people who take advantage of the vulnerable. So there is a recruitment phase, then there's grooming, and then there's trafficking. And grooming can kind of be, that's more of the psychological part. It might not necessarily be grooming, but it's, favors of you do this for me, and I guess the grooming process when you're looking at youth, this can take, depending on how vulnerable the child is, this can take hours, this could take days, weeks, months, sometimes years to get this child to trust somebody to the point of, becoming a victim in this, which the whole grooming process, they are a victim, by the way. But in order to actually go through with these acts can take a very long time. And, like I said before, traffickers have multiple girls, so they have time to invest into people they think is going to make them a profit. So they will take their time to build this trust of, I need you to do these things for me. So as far as the recruiting, this goes a couple different ways. When you look at human trafficking and there's like a hierarchy or, a stable is what you would refer to it as, of typically girls. This can be boys as well, but typically girls. There's a stable, and there's always one of the victims who is the top. So we call it the bottom girl. I'll keep it PG. So there's another word for it, but so the bottom girl is actually, like the girlfriend or the wife or the most trusted of the stable, and her job is really to keep the other girls in line. So when you look at recruiting, and maybe you guys have seen pictures or stories on human trafficking and you've seen what they look like, and some of these people you would never guess would be traffickers. Some of them you look at them and you're like, that's a very scary person, like how could that happen? So this is how it can happen. When you have a stable and you have girls or women as part of it, those could be your recruiters. So they're the ones who look less threatening and trying to be friends with potential victims and kind of bring them in of, I can do all these things for you. Oh, your parents won't do this for you, or I can show you a good time, hang out with my group of friends. Like that type of situation, it's less threatening when a female confronts a female as like a friendship than if a man comes up and just starts like hanging around them and asking for, sexual favors, which also does happen, by the way. But so recruiting can go a couple different ways. It's very popular now to do online. A lot of kids are online. A lot of kids have social media, especially if they don't know how to set privacy parameters where everything is public and they're posting things about their school and the sports they're in, pictures of their family. They're linking things with other family members. So when traffickers start researching them online, they're able to get a whole bunch of information just from looking at certain posts. And it also is a place where any teenager who gets upset with their parents, and I'm going to say teenagers, this is really any child, and they post like, oh my God, my mom is, she's terrible, or I'm so mad at my mom right now, or whatever it is. Maybe it's grandma, aunt, uncle, whatever. Those traffickers look for that, and then that's when they start sending their messages like, oh, you're too pretty to be upset, I would never treat you that way, what is it that you need, let me help you. So things like that. And they can pose as other people, as we all have heard about catfishing. They could pull a picture off of Google of another child and set up a whole account talking to your child or somebody you know posing as somebody else. So it's not hard to know what lingo is when you're constantly going through kids, Facebook profiles, Instagram. You know what they like, you know what they don't like. Now you know what school they go to, you know what they like as far as sports and boys and bands, and so it's very easy to build that rapport, and the child has no idea that they don't know this person. So, and that's the communication part. Then, when you go into the grooming, it becomes more of a domestic violence relationship as far as the power and control. It's not always physical abuse that does happen, but it can just be, I'm your boyfriend, you're going to do this for me. If you love me, you'll do this for me type of situation. They start to isolate them, taking them away from their friends, asking their friends to lie for them. You're going to say that you're going to this person's house, and with three-way calling, it's very easy to pretend you're someplace where you are not. So I suggest people put trackers on their children's devices so you know where they are. It's not that not all kids are bad, and I'm not saying they are. They can just get sucked into this and not even know what it is until it gets to a point where they're embarrassed to say something, and now they feel like they cannot come back. The manipulation part, and then when you get to the trafficking, some of these kids live at home. Some of their parents have no idea that this is what's happening. Sometimes their parents or guardians are the traffickers. Sometimes it's their siblings. Sometimes it's cousins. I mean, you name it. We always talk about stranger danger, and all of, when you're talking to kids, it's parents have the talk about stranger danger, which typically in situations with child sexual abuse, it's usually not a stranger who is coming for your child. It's somebody that they trust and they know and who is in your circle, which seems very scary, and it shouldn't be, because we just need to have more open conversations with our kids about what's acceptable and what's not, and how they need to feel valued enough where these things are less likely to happen, because they're more open to say, I got this weird message from somebody I don't know, or I got a weird message from Uncle Joe and I didn't like it, or this person's following me, or they tried to, rub my back and it was weird. So you want to have these conversations where they feel like you can confront this right away. We talk about trusted adults, where they should always have somebody where they can go to and just say something's not right.
A couple of thoughts just before we move on from this slide. One of the things that I've been on this journey to learn more about human trafficking for about the last 2 years. I was not an original member of the task force, but have joined on now. You notice that the van and the person jumping out of the bushes to grab somebody is not part of this slide. It is something that happens. It's something that we need to be concerned about, and our kids need to be concerned about. But that is not what is typical for us in human trafficking investigations. Usually it's this process. To Jamie's point about the online, in the City of Milton Police Department, we have had a case of a middle schooler who was befriended by somebody online, and the person was able, throughout the grooming process, able to convince her to send him a nude photo. And then that was the pressure that he used to continue the abuse process, because he basically said, now I gotcha, and I'm going to send this picture to your parents, and because I know what school you go to and I know your sports teams, I'm going to send them to your coaches, I'm going to send them to your grandparents, and then that coercion kept the child doing these acts. It never got to the point where it was in-person human trafficking, thankfully, because she finally disclosed, and we were able to work on that case from that point. But that's how quickly these things can happen.
Want to do this?
Yeah, we've kind of been threading this all in throughout the whole presentation. Jamie touched on how, if I'm a drug dealer and I run out of drugs, I can't sell anything anymore. So I need to re-up and find my own supply source and get more. And when you're dealing with human beings, there's no need to do that. And they are just there and can be used over time. These are difficult investigations to work. again, because of the shame, because of the victims not feeling comfortable to come forward. So because they're difficult cases to investigate, it immediately becomes a low risk to the person that is doing the operation, the perpetrator, as we were calling it. The availability online is getting, it has made the problem even more spread. You probably remember from a couple of years ago, there was a lot of talk about Craigslist and their ads, and a couple of the internet sites that were primarily dedicated to sex trafficking were actually shut down by the federal government. But that has pushed people into other areas of the internet. It by no means has stopped it. So we're continuing to deal with this on an online situation too.
Well, when you look at, thriving, essentially another easy way to kind of break that down for you is that if you have, a trafficker driving with a child in the car and they get pulled over for something, first of all, there's usually a script of, I'm your uncle or I'm your dad or whatever it is, I am this person to you. So let's say, for instance, like the car gets searched or whatever it is. I mean, it's just a simple, okay, sometimes you're on your way. Like you're not thinking, oh my gosh, this is human trafficking, this child is being transported. Now, when you look at somebody who gets pulled over who's drunk driving, or they have a weapon in the car, or they have drugs in the car or something like that, those are retrievable, and they can be dealt with essentially right away. So it's very a plain day in sight crime where you just don't know what exactly is happening. And it's the same with, people who are walking down the street with younger women. Like this could be a dad and his daughter's friends. This could be a grandpa and his granddaughter and all of his grandkids. Like you don't know. You can't just pull everyone aside and be like, how are you related to someone else? So that's also why this is hard to track, because it's just out there. We see it every single day. You just don't know exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah, to your point, a canine doesn't alert on a car with a human trafficking situation. I mean, that's one of the tools we use for drug investigations. It just doesn't work in this. You could see the risk factors there. They all dovetail perfectly with training you may have already had about child abuse or sexual abuse. Even with the adults, domestic abuse. These are victims who are already set up to be victims based upon their vulnerabilities, and the traffickers know that, and they will target on these things, and they will figure out if there is substance abuse, and then they become the substance abuse source, and things go on from there. Of course, our LGBTQ community, because of stigma and because of the vulnerabilities there, they become victims as well. Jamie talked about earlier, sometimes this is a family thing where we've had cases where we've intervened and people say, look, I'm the fourth generation of my family that's done this. It's all I've ever known. So we need to be aware of these things and keep our kids from becoming in these vulnerable situations as best as we can. And that's why we're happy to have a lot of the social service and volunteer organizations involved in this task force that fight things like poverty and homelessness, and so we can avoid a potential victim from being vulnerable to begin with.
So, and then when you look at, obviously age is a big thing. Our brains don't stop growing until we're around 25, 26 years old. So anything under that, it's very easy to mold somebody into a person that you want them to be with the control aspect. Also, when you put any kind of drug or alcohol abuse onto that, if people are heavy users, your brain can stop at that developmental age, which is why when you see people who are recovering addicts, maybe into their 30s and 40s, they're acting like they're a teenager because they just haven't evolved past that. So we need to look at that. When you look at the trauma history, most kids who are sexually abused, when there's a history of sexual abuse and they are recovered from human trafficking, that is like a big thing most of them have. And a lot of them, especially if they're runaways, which traffickers call them throwaways, they're children who, when they go missing, a lot of people either don't report them because they've run away so many times that, well, maybe they'll come back. I'm not going to waste my time on that. And these are the adults in their life. It's not law enforcement. It's not medical. These are adults who are supposed to be responsible for these kids who keep running away. Well, we need to figure out, why are you running away? Some of them, when they're recovered, will just say, well, I'd rather, do all these sex acts with these random people I don't know and I'm never going to see again than with my dad or my grandpa or my uncle or my brother. I had to get away from that, and this is better for me. You have to take into account trauma history is huge, and we need to figure out how to get them past that and onto a better path, and that they're worth more. I always go over the value part. People really need to value their bodies and who they are as people, and they just need a support system around them to let them know that we do value you. I don't know any of you who are watching this, but I can tell you I love every single one of you. And I say that to my patients too, because I think it just takes one to say, I care about you and I want to help you, and that's why I'm here. This is about the same, a little bit similar to our last slide. These are the red flag indicators that people who deal with human trafficking victims will see some of these things. Now, these aren't always the red flags that we see, but the dress and clothing, it can be a thing where a parent is all of a sudden saying, well, I didn't buy these clothes for them, or this isn't something that I would get for them. I don't know where they're getting it from. Sometimes it's from other adults or friends around that victim who know their financial situation or their home environment of how are you affording to do all of these things. So that's a red flag. The language can be a little bit different. I've learned a lot of language that I never probably would have known. As far as like what drugs are called, what the hookups are called, just when you look at kids who are texting people, there's certain, letters that they use, like if a parent's over their shoulder or their parents are sleeping or something's going on, like there's all of these different codes that they use. The fake ID part, that can be, I think law enforcement more deals with that part when they search somebody or retrieve somebody and they find all of these things. It can happen on the medical aspect as far as just going through things and, hey, you have 4 IDs, which one are you? Or they don't even know who they are. The documents, if they don't have any. If you look at somebody, the stated age is really hard unless you know who the child is, because you can look at a 10-year-old and they can look like they're 16. So for us, it's hard as far as law enforcement and medical to really gauge somebody's age if we don't know what their age is, because even some of our adult population who are in their 20s can look like they're 15. So that's more for people who are around these kids, knowing like, hey, this girl's 13, she's saying she's 18. No, that's not right. The location, so that's the address, the city, that type of thing. We get plenty of people who have no idea where they are. They might not even know they're in Wisconsin. They're not from here because they've been to so many different places, but sometimes they just need help for something, so they'll come in and then they're not able to give us any information. That also goes with the poor historian part, where they don't know. They've been traveling all night. They have no idea where they are right now. The discrepancy between stated history and clinical presentation would be more on my end, where they're saying, they're having stomach pain, but they don't really know why, and then I find a bunch of things on them or that is wrong with them, but they're not admitting that that's what happened. But common sense and medical knowledge tells me I already know what it was. So they just don't add up. The numerous sex partners, doesn't know number. That's not something I personally ask people. It really is none of my business. It is what it is. What I do care about with youth is how old people are and why they are participating in these things. If it's a 13-year-old who I recently had, and a 61-year-old, that's a little concerning to me. Same with if it's even somebody who's over 15 with a 13-year-old. That's, I mean, peer-on-peer relationships, not saying sexual, that shouldn't be happening, but we're talking about youth who can be curious and hormonal. Not saying that's okay, but those are different things that we look for, and I need to know how old these people are because that's where our crime is. And that's what we're trying to prevent from other children becoming victims as well. And then just the possession of things. The one thing that's not listed on here is cell phones. We've had lots of children who have either a cell phone their parents didn't know about, they didn't buy, they don't know where they're getting it from, or they have multiple cell phones, or they have hidden apps. So different communication pieces where my big thing for parents is that if you are supplying your child with a phone, and not all kids are bad, I'm not saying that, but if you're supplying them with something, you have control over it. So there shouldn't be a pass lock on it. You should always know what that is. You should know what apps they're putting on. You should have some sort of restrictions because it's very easy to go down these holes and they don't know how they got down there because it's very easy. So if you can kind of control a little bit and teach them how to use it properly with these different conversations, then hopefully we can prevent that other piece down the road.
Excuse me, I wanted to add one thing in terms of the risk factors and the red flag indicators, and especially from the education, the educator position on what we see in schools, is it's really important for us as adults to have these conversations and know what we're looking at. But I know that we have all talked with each other on the task force that if I can look back 5-6 years ago, and if I had only known what I was seeing when I put not just one or two of these together, you put multiple of risk factors and indicators together, and then that's when you start seeing things through a different lens. And one of the most important conversations to have is with our youth, because we used to say we were the first responders, but we're not. It's our kids who know much more about what's happening with their friends, what's happening in their social media, what if they're starting to isolate. And so one of the really important pieces of this is we have education programs for our students in the Janesville School District starting in 4th and 5th grade. And of course those are age appropriate conversations, but I know this spring before we got shut down, when Jamie and I went into 3 of the different elementary schools, it was amazing the conversations to have with 4th and 5th graders and how much they know and how much they know that they can get away with not sharing if a parent isn't really engaged. So also in Rock County, we had to keep in mind that we have one of the highest ACEs scores in the state, and so we have a very vulnerable population to begin with, as Scott spoke to earlier. So I would encourage you, when you have the opportunities to have conversations with your kids about these things, or you might start noticing things about their friends, to not hesitate to reach out to somebody if you're not sure in law enforcement or anyone on the task force. That's one of the great things about our task force, is because we all do coordinate with each other, and at any point we can text each other and say, hey, I have this concern, or get you in contact. So I know law enforcement would much rather have 300 calls that don't amount to anything than miss one that they could have intervened.
Well, there's just one question. If you ever just want to have a conversation with your child or a niece or a nephew or your neighbor, something to get this conversation going, it really just comes down to one question. And all you really need to ask is, if they're on social media, have you ever received a message from somebody you don't know? And you would be amazed at how many, especially with our 4th and 5th graders when we were in their class, when we asked who was on social media and then asked them, have you ever gotten a message from somebody you don't know? All of their hands went up. Every single child's hand went up. That is what we're trying to prevent, of the safety issue and how these people have such easy access to our youth.
Quick story, just this last weekend I got a phone call from a friend of mine who heard from a friend of hers that she was at a house. She happened to be at the house to buy marijuana, but noticed people coming and going, a gentleman coming out of the house kind of putting himself back together like he was putting his clothes on, knows the kind of other activities that happen there, and knows some of these indicators, and asked the question of her friend, who then asked me, I wonder if human trafficking is going on, what do I do? And that's how it starts. It starts with this sort of base knowledge that, 20 years ago when I was working patrol, I didn't know these things, and now I do. So spreading this information out, starting at a very young age to kind of explain how the process works, and then knowing what you're seeing when you see it is going to be an important thing.
Here's some of the physical indicators. These can or cannot be present. So any kinds of physical harm. So you see like the bruising, broken bones, that type of thing, missing teeth. Really any kind of physical trauma to a human being that looks suspicious, especially in our youth. So the rule of thumb in the medical field is that if you don't cruise, you don't bruise, which essentially means for children, it is very abnormal to have bruising on their stomachs or their backs or different parts of their body, especially if they're not mobile. Now for toddlers, it's normal. Their head is heavier than their body. They hit their head on everything. They have bruises on their shins from crawling on everything, that type of situation. So then we look at other indicators. But it is really hard even for an adult to get a bruise on your back. To get something on your stomach. Somebody has to usually do that to you. Plus, we have a lot of organs that protect things like that from happening. So we need to ask, well, how would that be possible? Especially with dental things. People don't always go to the dentist, but when you have teeth falling out of your mouth, is it because of drug use? Is it because you've been neglected? Is it because you just don't have the resources to go get that checked? Or is it because somebody knocked them out? Self-harming behaviors. People don't just one day decide, I'm gonna, start cutting myself, or I'm gonna start, doing all of these things to harm myself. There's usually something that happened right before that where this is how they're going to deal with it, some sort of trauma, their trigger. So we need to start looking at things like that. The multiple STDs, those are people obviously who probably are doing things either they're not willing to do, they've been forced to do, they don't know how to protect themselves, different conversations that way. The malnutrition, dehydration, why aren't they being fed or given anything to drink, especially when it's a child. That goes more under physical abuse as well. The substance abuse issue, how are you getting access to this? If you're homeless or you're a runaway, how do you have access to all of these drugs that are your substance of choice? Where are you getting the money for that? How are people supplying that to you? What are they having you do in return? So the unusual or rare infections, there's a lot of things in the medical field, that we've tried to eliminate that's why we have vaccinations. I'm not saying, yes, you need to vaccinate everybody for everything. I'm also saying you should vaccinate for things that are preventable. However, either way, when you're looking at things that shouldn't be here or people shouldn't have, so like hepatitis C, usually you're going to get that, through some sort of needle use, or, some high risk behavior with sexual activities. The physical indicators of stress, that's people pulling their hair out, that's people, being anorexic, bulimic, that type of thing. And then the branding and tattoos, that can happen. It's less likely here in Rock County. I have seen it. Actually, people have invisible tattoos as well, so we have black lights now. We get to use a lot of cool things to kind of look at people. But if you get rapport with somebody, they usually will tell you, well, I did get this weird mark, or they did put this thing on me. And the branding is more just letting other people know, as far as other traffickers, Johns, whatever you want to call them, that this person belongs to me. And that if that person's not going to belong to them, usually they sell that person to another human being, which is our slavery aspect as well.
So we're going to, looks like we're kind of down to our 1 minute. I would really encourage you to please take a look at this slide. This is ever changing. But if you'll go through the rest of your, the presentation and take a look at the apps and then the other information we have at the end. We are available to answer any of your questions, depending on what your time limit is. We're happy to stay on a few minutes longer. That's what we typically do individually. And you have our contact information. That is also our Facebook administrator is daily Facebook as well as answering questions. It's a great way to reach out to us. And we really, really appreciate you asking us to present this training for you. And hopefully we'll get to do it live for you at some point. And again, we'll stay on a few minutes if you have any individual questions, but and take the survey, please. Scott, Jamie? I don't think it's the last slide. I think there's,
A couple more.
I think it's almost to the end.
Yeah.
I want to thank you guys. I know I talk a lot and I try to talk really fast because I could talk for days about this and what we see in the different cases we've had to kind of make it. I think the most frustrating part for all of us on the task force is that people just still think it's not here. They think that there's certain things, that you're just going to see it. And that's couldn't be farther from the truth. And when we do get people talking, it's always very eye-opening. I learn something new every day when we deal with any victim of human trafficking, but particularly the youth. They know so much about the world. They are very much adult little people, I call them. They know things that they shouldn't know. They've been exposed to things that they shouldn't be. And they're put in situations that I cannot even imagine being put in. They're very resilient. They are amazing. All of our population is very amazing. They're very strong, especially when they come out and they're brave enough to tell us what had been going on and their fears, and then they're reassured that we're going to do everything we can to make sure that nobody hurts them, and give all of these resources. So it is, we have an amazing community here. I don't live here, I just work here, but it is, you guys are very lucky to work in a place like this, because I've worked in other communities before that they still don't have anything in place to kind of combat this. So thank you for your time.
Chief?
I just want to say thank you as well, and if you any questions at all, you're not even law enforcement, if you want to reach out to me, that's fine. If you're a City of Milton resident and just want more information, please look me up. It's something that we need to keep talking about, and when you know better, you do better, and that's what we as a community are trying to do with this.